Karen slaps Barista for writing her name wrong. Didn't know it was a deaf worker. The morning buzzed with the usual chaos inside the downtown coffee shop. A warm, bustling haven tucked between sleek office buildings and aging bookstores. The scent of roasted beans, buttery croissants, and cinnamon clung to the air as regulars jostled in line, clutching bags, laptops, and half-finished text messages on glowing phones. Ava stood at the counter, her apron freshly tied, her long dark hair tucked into a neat bun, and her fingers moving swiftly as she took each customer's name with a nod and a kind smile. Though she couldn't hear the clamor that filled the space, the low rumble of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, the occasional impatient sigh, she felt it all through vibrations and practiced observation, watching mouths move, reading expressions, and relying on her steady inner rhythm. She was deaf, yes, but she was sharp, efficient, and deeply beloved by many of the shop's regulars for her calming presence and unflappable patience. The day had started off smoothly until the heavy glass door flung open with a screech, followed by the staccato click of high heels and the shrill bark of a voice that cut through the hum of the morning crowd. "Is this seriously the line?" the woman muttered loudly, though not to anyone in particular. She looked out of place among the casual patrons, wrapped in designer layers and carrying a handbag that screamed excess. Her blonde bob was rigidly styled, her lips overly lined, and her sunglasses, though the sun barely crept above the city buildings, remained firmly planted on her face. Her energy was harsh, impatient, entitled. She checked her phone and grumbled again, drawing glances from the people around her, who instinctively stepped a little further away to avoid being the target of her next complaint. When it was finally her turn, she strutted forward, eyes scanning the menu as if it was written in a foreign language and everyone had conspired to make it more confusing just for her. Fine, I'll take a double-shot iced oat milk latte, light on the ice, extra caramel drizzle, and it better be the right milk this time," she snapped, not even looking up as she rattled off the order. Ava offered a soft smile and gestured for her to repeat it a little slower, holding up a notepad she used for particularly fast talkers or complicated drink requests. The woman sighed dramatically, exaggerating her annoyance, then slowly repeated the order like she was speaking to a toddler. "And my name is Karen. That's Caryn, not Cairn." "Got it, Karen," she emphasized, enunciating each letter like it was a royal decree. Ava nodded, fingers quickly jotting the name down as best she could from the way it sounded. Names were always tricky. Customers often spoke fast, slurred them, or gave spellings that didn't match how they were pronounced. But she was used to navigating those gaps. Phonetics helped, and most people didn't mind a misspelling on a paper cup. The barista handed the note to the drink station and moved to the next customer as the woman, Karen, took a call and began packing near the pickup counter, voice rising with every sentence. "No, I told him Thursday. Not today. If he shows up now, I swear I'm going to lose it. People are just so stupid sometimes." Behind the counter, the coffee machine hissed, steam curling into the air as Ava worked alongside her coworkers, efficiently marking cups and preparing ingredients. She never let rude customers get to her, at least not deeply. She had built up a quiet wall of peace around herself. The kindness of others, the rhythm of her job, the small joys of smiles and returning faces helped her carry on. Still, there were moments when cruelty cut through, even when she tried not to let it. She hoped this woman would simply take her drink and leave. The barista at the drink station, a younger guy named Evan, finished the latte and called out, "Iced oat milk latte for Cairn," holding the cup above the counter. The woman froze mid-sentence on her call and stormed toward him, snatching the cup from his hand with a glare. "It's Karen. Are you blind or just illiterate?" she snapped, her voice rising above the chatter in the shop. People turned their heads. A man working on his laptop paused, brows lifting. A mom with 2 kids near the window winced as Karen continued, waving the cup in the air. "I spelled it out. You had one job." Evan blinked, confused, and opened his mouth to respond, but Ava stepped forward quickly, trying to defuse the situation. She gestured toward herself, then pointed to the notepad, trying to communicate that she had written the name down phonetically. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Oh great, now you're playing dumb. What, you don't talk? Is this some kind of joke?" she sneered, taking a step forward. Ava calmly reached into her apron and pulled out a card she carried for situations like this, one that explained she was deaf and used lip reading and writing to communicate. She offered it with an open expression, hoping this would settle things. But instead of understanding, Karen slapped the card out of her hand, the small rectangle fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. "You wrote Karen on purpose. You think it's funny to call people Karens now, huh? Because of your TikTok generation or whatever," she shouted, jabbing a manicured finger in Ava's direction. The room quieted. Even the hiss of the milk frother seemed to die away. Ava stood still, hands shaking just slightly, trying to maintain her composure, her wide eyes blinking back confusion and fear. She didn't expect what came next. Without warning, Karen raised her hand and slapped Ava across the cheek. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The mother by the window covered her child's eyes. Evan rushed forward, stunned, grabbing Karen's wrist as Ava stepped back, her hand going to her cheek, her face paling. No one moved for a second. Then murmurs broke out. Someone whispered, "Did she just slap her?" Another voice, louder, said, "Call the manager." Karen, still breathing hard, turned and faced the now staring crowd, her righteous fury flickering just slightly into uncertainty as she realized the attention had shifted. The energy in the room turned colder, more focused, disapproving. A woman in the corner stood up, pulling out her phone. Another man leaned toward the counter, urgently waving for a supervisor. And in the back room, the manager had already heard enough to come running. The moment Daniel emerged from the back, the entire room shifted. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet intensity of someone who had dealt with every kind of customer crisis imaginable. But the look on his face now was different, fierce, cold, and disbelieving. He pushed past the counter, his eyes immediately locking on Ava, who stood a few feet back, clearly shaken, her hand still pressed gently to her cheek. Her expression was one of practiced restraint, but Daniel knew her well enough to see through it. The edges of her lips trembled, and her posture had lost its usual confidence. He turned then, eyes falling on Karen, who stood with one arm still defensively lifted, as though expecting to be applauded for what she'd just done. The crowd remained mostly silent, their eyes bouncing between Ava and the woman who had just slapped her. A few phones were held up, recording now, and the collective weight of a dozen strangers' judgment pressed heavily into the space, humming with tension. "What the hell is going on here?" Daniel's voice was calm, but each word carried the unmistakable tone of authority. He didn't need to shout. The stillness in the room amplified his voice like a spotlight. Karen straightened, scoffing as she tossed her blonde hair back, removing her sunglasses to reveal sharp, angry eyes. "Your little worker wrote my name wrong on purpose. It's harassment. I'm tired of being called a Karen just because I want decent service," she said, enunciating each word as if she were delivering some sort of closing argument. She held up the coffee cup with Karen scrawled in black marker, pointing to it as though it was proof of a conspiracy against her. Daniel raised a hand, silencing her as he turned toward Ava. She looked up at him with a quiet sort of heartbreak, one that he had seen too many times when people forgot that not being able to hear didn't mean not being able to feel. He nodded at her, then turned back to Karen, his face unreadable. "Do you know who she is?" he asked, his voice low. Karen blinked, confused by the question, her aggression faltering slightly. "She's the barista that messed up my name," she snapped. "Isn't that her only job?" Daniel's expression hardened. "That's Ava. She's been working here for 3 years. She's one of the most dedicated employees I've ever had, and she's deaf." The last word hit the air with finality, and an audible murmur swept through the customers still watching. Karen's eyes widened, a visible flicker of realization crossing her face, but she masked it quickly with indignation. "So what? That gives her an excuse to get my name wrong and act like a victim when I correct her," she barked, her voice rising again, but now with an edge of defensiveness. She spelled it phonetically, Daniel said firmly, stepping forward. She hears sounds differently. She writes what she hears, and you slapped her because of it, in front of witnesses. He gestured around the room, where a dozen people stood silently, several with their phones still aimed at Karen, a few shaking their heads in disgust. Karen's face flushed deep red and her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right comeback but kept finding only silence. "I didn't know she was deaf," she muttered finally, folding her arms. "Well, you do now," Daniel replied, crossing his own arms. "And I'm going to ask you to leave this store, immediately, or I'll call the police and press charges for assault." Karen's eyes widened, her head snapping up as she laughed incredulously. "Assault? Are you serious? Over a name on a cup?" She spat, clearly trying to gain back control of the situation, but it was already gone. Daniel nodded. "You hit my employee, that's assault. And we have witnesses and video, so yes, I'm very serious." At that, the mother by the window stepped forward. "I saw the whole thing. She hit her because of the name on the cup, and Ava didn't even react. She just stood there trying to explain. That woman was completely out of line." Several other customers nodded in agreement. One even spoke up. She was mocking her for not speaking, and then she slapped her. No excuse. Karen took a step back, glancing around, clearly realizing just how cornered she was. Her outrage had mutated into disbelief and panic, and her mouth moved soundlessly for a second before she finally snarled, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," and turned to storm out of the cafe. But before she could reach the door, Daniel added, "You're banned from this location, permanently. Don't come back." She paused for only a fraction of a second, then pushed the door open so forcefully it banged against the wall. The entire room watched her leave, and the second the door swung shut behind her, the tension broke. Conversations resumed in low voices. Customers returned to their seats, some still shaken, others pulling out their phones to check the video they'd recorded. Evan exhaled beside Ava, rubbing the back of his neck. "You okay?" he asked gently. Ava nodded slowly, though her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Daniel approached her carefully, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. She met his eyes and he signed, "I'm proud of you," slowly and clearly. Her lips quivered in a small smile. The next hour passed slowly, and Ava took her break in the staff room, sipping water and breathing deeply. The buzz of what happened still hovered over the shop, with many customers quietly asking the other baristas if Ava was all right and if she needed anything. Daniel made sure to stay visible, checking in with everyone and letting them know that the situation had been handled. Outside the store, a small crowd had gathered, some drawn in by the videos that were already circulating on local social media, others simply curious about the commotion. Later, when Ava returned to the counter, she was greeted with warm smiles from several patrons, one of whom passed her a sticky note that simply said, "We support you. You're amazing." She smiled, nodded gratefully, and tucked it into her apron pocket. As she worked, a sense of quiet strength returned to her movements. The experience had rattled her, yes, but it had also reaffirmed something. She wasn't alone. People had stood up for her. Her manager had defended her without hesitation. And despite everything, she still loved her job, loved the rhythm of it, the people, the space she'd made her own. In the corner of the shop, a young man edited a video on his phone, footage of Karen's outburst followed by Daniel's calm but firm intervention. He looked up, glanced at Ava, then went back to typing the caption. Entitled Woman Slaps Deaf Barista Over Name Spelling, Immediate Karma. As he hit upload, he had no idea just how fast the video would spread. The next morning brought with it a tense calm that hung thick over the coffee shop like a storm cloud that hadn't yet decided whether to burst or drift silently by. The early hours were usually filled with the cheerful hustle of regulars chatting and baristas exchanging friendly greetings, but today the atmosphere was heavy, punctuated by whispers, and the faint buzzing of phones as news of the previous day's incident spread far beyond the shop's walls. Ava arrived earlier than usual, her shoulders tense and her eyes weary from a sleepless night of thinking and rethinking the moment she was struck across the face, the sting of it lingering not just on her skin but in the quiet corners of her mind. She had dealt with rudeness before, the occasional condescension or awkward stares when customers realized she couldn't hear them. But this had been different. It was violence, born from entitlement and ignorance, and it had happened in front of everyone. Daniel greeted her with a soft nod and a reassuring smile as she walked in, handing her a fresh pastry bag and a cup of her favorite tea. He didn't need to say anything. The gesture spoke for itself. She gave him a small, grateful smile and signed a thank you before heading to the back to place her things in her locker. The shop had already begun to fill with customers, but instead of the usual impersonal bustle, there was a collective energy of anticipation, a sense that people were watching closely, waiting to see how she would carry herself, what she would do, and more importantly, what would happen next. Ava, always poised and gentle, tied her apron with steady hands and took her position at the register like she always did, determined not to let the previous day define her. Within an hour, the line stretched to the door, and as patrons reached the front, many took a few seconds longer than usual, offering soft smiles, kind nods, or quietly placing post-it notes and folded pieces of paper on the counter. Some simply tapped the top of the tip jar with a smile. One man even signed "thank you" awkwardly but earnestly before moving to the side. Ava, though still a bit raw inside, felt the first real warmth of healing begin to bloom. She wasn't invisible. People had seen what happened, and more importantly, they had cared. Meanwhile, Daniel's office in the back was a whirlwind of phone calls, media inquiries, and coordination. The viral video, now circulating widely across social platforms, had been picked up by a local news station overnight. They had blurred Ava's face for privacy but clearly showed the slap, Karen's outburst, and Daniel's calm, no-nonsense response. It had struck a nerve. Thousands of comments poured in, some offering solidarity, others demanding justice, and a surprising number from people sharing their own stories about working in customer service while dealing with disabilities or invisible challenges. Daniel hadn't expected the firestorm of attention, but he was determined to use it as a force for something better. At around 10:45 a.m., a woman entered the store with a determined expression and a messenger bag slung over her shoulder. She was in her early 30s, dressed professionally, with a press badge clipped to her blouse. Her name was Melissa, a reporter from a well-known local outlet that had been following the story. She didn't carry a camera crew, only a small notebook and a recorder in her pocket, respecting the space. After ordering a drink and waiting in line like everyone else, she quietly approached Daniel when the morning rush had thinned and asked if Ava might be willing to speak, on her own terms, and only if she wanted to. Daniel asked Ava privately, signing carefully to explain the situation. Ava hesitated, unsure. She wasn't seeking attention, didn't want to be turned into a symbol or pitied on camera. But after a long pause, she agreed to speak, not for her own sake, but for the many deaf workers out there who were overlooked, underestimated, or mistreated simply for communicating differently. She met with Melissa at a quiet corner table, with Daniel nearby in case she needed anything, and wrote down answers to Melissa's gentle questions. It wasn't a formal interview, more of a conversation about what it felt like to work in a world that wasn't built for you, and how kindness from strangers could mean more than anyone realized. Ava explained in writing how she had lost her hearing as a child, how she had fought hard to learn how to lip read, how she could speak, but often chose not to because of anxiety about being misunderstood. She described the joy she found in her job, the pride she took in getting every order just right, and the heartbreak of being treated like a nuisance instead of a person. Melissa listened intently, her eyes occasionally misting, and promised to treat the story with dignity and respect. The article would focus not on the slap itself, but on Ava's resilience and the importance of accessibility and empathy in the workplace. That afternoon, a man in his mid-60s arrived with a small bouquet of flowers in a trembling hand. He waited patiently in line, then asked one of the other baristas if Ava was available. When she came out from the back, he stepped forward and gently handed her the flowers along with a handwritten card. "My granddaughter is deaf," he said slowly, almost tearfully. People don't always understand what that means, but you handled yesterday with more grace than most people could. I'm sorry you went through that, and I want you to know you're not alone. Ava read the card, then placed a hand over her heart and nodded, deeply moved. The flowers were placed in a jar behind the counter, brightening the space in more ways than one. By the time the store began winding down for the day, the article had been published. Grace in the Face of Cruelty, a deaf barista's quiet strength, was the headline, accompanied by photos of Ava at work, one from the shop's employee page and another taken that morning with her permission. The story trended within hours. Daniel's inbox overflowed with messages from local businesses asking how they could better accommodate deaf employees. A small advocacy group even reached out to offer support and sponsor a Deaf Awareness Week at the coffee shop, complete with materials, training, and interpreters who would volunteer their time. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, Ava stepped outside to take a breath. The street was calmer now, bathed in gold, with traffic slowed to a lazy crawl and people meandering home with their coffees in hand. She looked at the horizon, then down at her hands, flexing her fingers slowly. She hadn't planned for this to happen, hadn't asked to be seen in this way. But maybe, just maybe, something good could come of it. Not just for her, but for every person who'd ever been told they were too quiet, too different, or too much work to understand. Ava turned back toward the shop, her reflection glancing back at her in the glass, soft but steady, scarred but standing. And that was enough. The fourth day after the incident began with a quiet drizzle, the kind that painted the sidewalks in a silver sheen and dulled the harsh noises of the city into a rhythmic hush. The coffee shop windows fogged up from the warmth inside, and the usual crowd filtered in with umbrellas dripping, jackets damp, and hearts a little softer than they had been a week ago. It wasn't just any Thursday anymore. This was the day that Ava had become more than a barista to the community. She had unintentionally become a symbol, a quiet storm of patience and strength, and the air in the shop carried the subtle energy of people wanting to be part of something better, something kinder. The tip jar overflowed. The comment board, which had once been used for silly doodles and caffeine-fueled jokes, was now covered in notes of encouragement, apologies from strangers, and thank you messages written in neat and not-so-neat handwriting. Ava stepped behind the counter as she always did, her expression calm but her mind swirling with thoughts she didn't quite know how to organize. There had been so many moments since the slap, people hugging her, media requests, sign language interpreters showing up to volunteer lessons, coworkers learning simple signs to greet her. It was overwhelming in a way that was both beautiful and exhausting. She appreciated the support deeply, but it also reminded her of how rare that kind of recognition was. For years she had worked twice as hard to be understood, to be seen as capable, and yet it took one cruel, public moment of humiliation for people to truly notice her. Daniel had been incredibly supportive through it all, taking on the media circus and managing customer expectations with the kind of unwavering calm that made everyone around him feel protected. He had even added a sign near the register that read, "Please speak clearly and respectfully. Some of our staff use alternative communication methods." Next to it was a stack of laminated cards explaining the basics of interacting with deaf workers, and they were being picked up and read by nearly every customer in line. But despite the positive turn, Ava still felt the weight of that slap echoing in quieter ways. The memory of Karen's face, the condescension, the mockery, the anger, still visited her in the quiet moments. It hadn't been just a misunderstanding. It had been a choice. Someone had chosen to lash out at her not because of a name, but because they viewed her as less. Mid-morning, Daniel approached her with a cautious expression. He tapped her shoulder gently and signed, "There's someone here asking to speak with you. You don't have to say yes." Ava raised an eyebrow, tilting her head in question. Daniel hesitated before signing again. "It's her, the woman, Karen." The name sent a ripple down Ava's spine. She hadn't expected to hear it again so soon. Her stomach clenched, her hands going still as she processed the information. 1,000 thoughts swirled in an instant. Why was she here? What did she want? Would it happen again? Was this another confrontation, another performance of entitled rage? Ava looked to Daniel, who added quickly, "She says she wants to apologize. She's alone." Ava breathed in slowly and gave the smallest nod. She wasn't sure what she was about to walk into, but she knew one thing: she would not be the one hiding. Daniel led her to the side entrance, where Karen stood holding a damp umbrella and a paper bag. She looked different. The usual fire in her posture was gone, replaced by something heavier, more subdued. Her makeup was minimal, her hair undone by the rain, and for the first time, she didn't wear that smug veil of superiority. When she saw Ava, her shoulders visibly tensed, then dropped. "Hi," she said, her voice low and unfamiliar. Ava didn't respond verbally, just stood quietly watching. Karen fidgeted, then reached into the bag and pulled out a small notebook. "I didn't know how else to do this," she said, holding it out. "So I wrote it." Ava took the notebook carefully and flipped it open. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but readable. It started with an apology, not just for the slap, but for the assumption, the cruelty, the mocking tone. Karen had written about how ashamed she was after watching the video, how she hadn't even realized how out of control she looked until she saw herself from the outside. She admitted that she had been angry about 1,000 things that had nothing to do with Ava, but that didn't excuse what she'd done. She had lashed out at someone who had done nothing but try to serve her a cup of coffee, and now she had to live with that being the defining moment of her public reputation. She ended with a line that made Ava pause. "You didn't deserve that, and I didn't deserve your silence after what I did, but I hope you'll accept mine now." Ava lowered the notebook slowly. Karen looked at her with damp eyes, waiting not for forgiveness, but for something closer to understanding. Ava didn't sign anything back. She simply nodded once and stepped back into the cafe, letting the door close behind her. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't closure, but it was something. Ava wasn't sure if she forgave Karen yet. That wasn't the point. What mattered was that the moment didn't define her. She had survived it. She had endured, and people had seen her. Not because she shouted, but because she stood still. Inside, Daniel met her with a questioning look, and Ava just smiled faintly and nodded. They didn't speak of it again. The day moved on, the customers kept coming, and Ava returned to her place behind the counter like she always had. But there was a difference now. A steady stream of customers made eye contact when they said their names. Some spelled them out slowly, kindly. Others brought cards with their names already written. Children pointed at the laminated "Learn to Sign" chart and tried mimicking the gestures. Ava watched all of it with quiet amazement. She had become a part of something bigger than herself. Not because she had asked for it, but because, when forced into the spotlight, she didn't let it burn her. She stood in it, eyes open, hands steady, heart strong. That evening, the sun peeked out through the gray clouds, casting a warm amber hue through the front windows. Ava stood at the sink rinsing out pitchers when Evan walked by, nudged her shoulder, and gestured to the tip jar. She glanced over and saw someone had dropped a gold pin inside, shaped like a hand, forming the sign for love. Her fingers brushed it gently as she pulled it out, her lips pressing into a soft smile. She didn't know who had left it, and maybe she never would, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they understood, that someone saw her, really saw her, and responded with care. As the store lights dimmed and chairs were lifted onto tables, Ava lingered a little longer than usual. She stared out at the quiet street beyond the glass, where a city kept moving and people kept changing, slowly, painfully, but surely. And in that moment, surrounded by the scent of coffee and paper and rain, she allowed herself the smallest breath of peace. The following Saturday dawned crisp and bright, the kind of morning where sunlight warmed the pavement just enough to make people slow down and smile a little more, the kind of day that felt like something was gently shifting toward healing. At the downtown coffee shop, the line stretched past the door as usual, but it wasn't just for the coffee anymore. Over the past few days, the space had transformed from a simple caffeine stop to something far more symbolic. What had begun as a routine customer service interaction gone terribly wrong had sparked a ripple across the city, conversations in schools, in newsrooms, around kitchen tables. Ava had never asked for any of it. She hadn't wanted to be famous, hadn't wanted her trauma broadcast to the world. But somehow, in simply standing still, in choosing to respond to cruelty with restraint and grace, she had become a living reminder of how much people still needed to learn, and how much better they could be once they did. The morning shift was in full swing when Daniel stepped up to the counter beside Ava, tapping her arm with a knowing smile. He signed, "You ready?" And she nodded with the same calm expression that had carried her through all of it, though her heart beat a little faster. Today wasn't just another workday. Today, the store was hosting its first ever Deaf Inclusion Day, an event organized not by a corporate team, but by a local network of volunteers, friends of Ava, and supporters who had watched the video and decided they wanted to be part of something meaningful. The front windows were decorated with soft blue banners that read "See Us, Hear Us," and a small table near the front displayed materials about deaf culture, basic sign language tips, and personal stories submitted by deaf individuals who wanted to share what life was like behind the silence. Throughout the morning, patrons came not just to order drinks but to learn. There were young couples learning how to sign "Thank you," children fascinated by the hand movements and eager to mimic them, and older customers who confessed they had never known how to communicate with someone who was deaf until now. Several members of the deaf community stopped in as well, some signing fluently with Ava, others exchanging heartfelt smiles with her from across the counter. Each interaction felt like a small thread pulling people closer together, like the start of a bridge being built not just for Ava, but for anyone who had ever felt isolated by difference. At noon, a local high school student stepped onto a small wooden platform near the register and began signing a poem she had written about connection, while her interpreter read the words aloud to the audience. "You speak with your hands, but I hear your heart. You move through a world not made for you, and yet you do not retreat. You plant flowers in the cracks of a sidewalk that never looked your way." The room had gone silent as the words echoed, and Ava, watching from behind the counter, felt her throat tighten. It wasn't often that people understood, and now here she was, watching others not only trying to understand, but choosing to. Midway through the afternoon, Daniel returned with a small box wrapped in soft white paper. He handed it to Ava with a sheepish smile, signing, "Everyone wanted to get you something. I just put it together." Inside was a necklace, simple, silver, and delicate. The pendant was the hand sign for "I love you," its fingers gently curved in the shape that Ava had used countless times in her life. She traced it slowly with her fingertip, then looked up and nodded, her eyes glistening. She couldn't find words for it, spoken or signed, but Daniel understood. Everyone did. Later that day, as the event began to wind down, a group of Ava's coworkers, friends, and even customers who had become regulars gathered around her for a group photo. A little boy tugged on her sleeve, holding up a crumpled napkin where he had drawn a picture of her smiling, with the words, "You're the best coffee hero," written in shaky handwriting. Ava crouched to hug him, and the room around them bloomed with quiet laughter and clapping hands. Cameras flashed, but Ava didn't flinch. For once, she didn't feel like the subject of a viral video or the quiet girl behind the counter who had been slapped. She felt like herself again, strong, whole, and surrounded by people who finally saw her not in spite of her silence, but because of it. Just before closing, Ava took a moment to step outside. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the city in rich golds and fatting oranges. She leaned against the brick wall and watched people pass by, some carrying coffee cups from the store, others pausing to look at the signs in the window or take photos of the event. She saw two teenagers signing clumsily to one another, laughing as they tried to get the shapes right, and a mother showing her young daughter the pamphlet on how to greet a deaf person. None of this had existed a week ago. None of this would have happened if not for that awful moment. Ava didn't believe that everything happened for a reason, not exactly, but she did believe in what people chose to do with what happened. She believed in what they chose to become after. As she turned to go back inside, she spotted a familiar face across the street. Karin stood half-shielded in the shadow of a bookstore awning, holding a to-go cup with both hands, eyes fixed on the coffee shop she had once stormed out of in rage. She looked smaller than Ava remembered, her expression unreadable. Ava met her eyes for just a second. Karin gave a short nod, not a wave, not an approach, just a brief gesture of acknowledgement, and then turned and walked away into the crowd. Ava didn't feel anger. She didn't feel fear. She felt distance, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that while Karin had walked away from the moment, Ava had walked through it. And she had emerged with more than just dignity. She had emerged with community, with solidarity, and with a space that now stood as proof that even the most ordinary people, when seen fully, could spark extraordinary change. That night, as the last lights dimmed and the shop's doors were locked, Ava sat for a moment alone in the quiet space. The coffee machines were silent, the chairs turned upside down on tables, the smell of espresso lingering in the air like a memory. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the silver necklace, clasping it gently around her neck. It wasn't heavy. It was light. It was hers, and so was this piece. She didn't need applause or headlines. She didn't need to speak loudly. She never had. She only needed to be understood, and now finally she was.